Hello again. Welcome back to Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast. This is a podcast about board games where we talk about playing board games, we review board games, but we don't go through all those messy rules. I'm your host, Ryan Krim, and that's right, I got that introduction done at the beginning of the podcast. You know what that means? Progress, baby. As I said, this is a board game podcast, so this week we're going to follow our normal schedule. I'm going to talk about some games I've played recently, and then I'm going to move on to our feature game of the week. This is the third week of the month, so on the third week of the month we try to do solo games. So today's solo game is Thousand-Year-Old Vampire. A quick reminder, we don't discuss rules here on Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast, at least not in depth. I might give a short summary about how a game is played to help prove a point or to provide context on my discussion. So I will be placing links in the description of this video or podcast that go to videos that better explain the rules for the games I'm going to be discussing today. If you are interested in those links, please click on them. They go to great content creators that are going to teach you all the rules and everything you need to know to fully understand the discussion I'm going to be having here today. Moving right along, this has been a great week here. We have finally gotten a big box that contained a bunch of Arkham Horror, the card game stuff that we've been waiting for, which means I finally got to play more Arkham Horror, which was fantastic. About 2 months ago, we started the Dream Eater cycle. This is the campaign that came out last year. It's not the most recent campaign, as the current campaign that's being printed is the Innsmouth Conspiracy. But we've played through all the other campaigns, and so we were ready to start the Dream Eaters. Now, this one's a little bit different than normal. Normally in Arkham Horror, the card game, you've got a character card that details who your character is, gives you a couple special abilities, but the majority of your character is defined by a deck of cards. You build a deck at the beginning of the first mission of the campaign, and then over the course of the campaign, you're earning experience that allows you to buy upgrades to make your deck more powerful, more versatile, and it's a system I've absolutely fallen in love with. I've loved having the opportunity to play a bunch of different characters. I play a new one every campaign, and every character it seems like I enjoy more than the last. Maybe that's because the design is different. Maybe that's just because I'm better understanding how to build decks and how to optimize in each character. But that was a problem here for the Dream Eater cycle because it's a little bit different, as I said. In a normal campaign of Arkham Horror, the card game, you build a single deck, but in the Dream Eater cycle, you actually play as two different investigators. There are two separate campaigns that are half as long as normal that you play through, and these campaigns interconnect with each other and inform one another as you're progressing, which is a very interesting concept. The only downside is playing two different characters means you have to build two different decks. And as we were playing at 4 players, we simply didn't have enough cards to build 8 different investigator decks. We probably could have managed 6 or 7, but by that point, many of the cards that we would have wanted or even needed were already starting to run thin. So we had a problem on our hands. Fortunately, we had a brilliant solution. A new product just came out for Arkham Horror, the card game, which are these individually packaged investigator starter decks, which I think are a great product. Essentially, they're a self-contained deck built around a brand new investigator, and they're meant for players who want to just jump into a game. They're great if you've bought the core set and you want to just start playing right away. You don't want to have to deal with building your own deck. You can pick up one of these starter investigator decks and immediately start playing. They're perfect for new players, and to be honest, I think they're perfect for experienced players too, because they offer a whole bunch of new options in the form of new investigators, but they also give you a whole bunch of new cards added to your card pool that you can add to decks regardless of who you're playing and in whatever campaign that you want. So I love this product, but there's a problem in that our pre-order didn't get sent to us on time because there was a shipping issue of some kind, I think is what I understood. And the shipping container that arrived for Fantasy Flight Games was damaged in some way, and so some of their stock couldn't be sent out. So we were afraid that we were going to be stuck not getting our investigator decks until maybe even February, which would have been a real shame. Luckily, though, I don't know what happened on the back end, but we got our decks last week. We've been waiting for 2 months now, and so we were able to move forward in our campaign, and it was fantastic. The decks are just as cool as I'd hoped they'd be. Moving on the cycle felt great. Admittedly, we probably could have finagled something, put together just some shoddy decks to just try to keep going, but we really wanted to wait for these new ones to come in, and it gave us a chance to, play some games we haven't played in a while. We don't play Arkham Horror every week, but we played enough that I could foresee some games are kind of nudged out of the spotlight. As for the Dream Eater cycle, I'm enjoying it pretty well. It's not my favorite cycle so far. I don't really like playing two different investigators. One of my favorite things about the game is seeing your starting investigator kind of grow over the course of each mission or each scenario. Seeing your deck grow from something really weak into something a lot more powerful, and having a lot of options and customization and creating the deck that you want to play. That exists in the Dream Eater cycle, sure, but because you're only technically playing 4 missions or 4 scenarios per character, you're technically playing half of a campaign with each character. So that character growth, that deck growth that you normally see is going to be pretty stunted. They do make up for it by giving you extra experience, the currency you use to buy new cards, but again, I'm a big fan of the slow burn. This is a game that has that slow burn in spades, so it's a shame to see it not as prevalent in this campaign. With all that said, though, I love Arkham Horror the card game, and honestly, I don't want to talk too much about how and why, because I'm sure I'm going to be doing a review on it at some point, and I'll save a lot of my discussion for then. And I got so excited talking about Arkham Horror the card game, I neglected to mention it was designed by Nate French and Matthew Newman, and it is published by Fantasy Flight Games. I had a chance to play The Arrival this week. This is a game designed by Martin Wallace, and it is published by Cryptozoic Entertainment. Now, I've played The Arrival before, but it's something that I'd really have to play some more to really start to understand. It's not a complex game. It's actually relatively simple. It's got a very interesting action selection mechanic with a little bit of push your luck kind of mixed in there. The object of the game is to essentially you're going to be drawing some cards from decks, and each card has 3 paths on it, and these paths show a number of symbols. Well, you'll line the cards up, you'll flip over the first 2, and then you're going to choose a path that you want to block. That path that you block is going to be a path you don't get any resources on. Then you flip over the 3rd card, you'll pick another path to block, and then you'll flip over the 4th card, and the path that you've left unblocked determines what resources you're getting. So at the beginning of the round, you'll know exactly which resources you're potentially getting from 2 cards. You'll know a little bit more in the 3rd card, but that 4th card is kind of a gamble, which is why I say there's a push your luck element to the game. That element is interesting, and overall I think the area control aspects of the game are also kind of interesting. The problem is that there's a complete dissonance between theme and mechanics in this game, to the point where I really didn't understand what I was supposed to be doing. That's not to say I didn't understand what the mechanics were. I knew what I was doing on my turn, what I could be doing on my turn. But what I was supposed to be doing didn't synergize with what it seemed like I was supposed to be doing. The general theme is that you are tribes in ancient Ireland, and you're trying to defend the nation from these encroaching demon-like creatures called Fomori. When you collect your resources from your cards, inevitably at some point you're going to be collecting corruption. Now, corruption is kind of its own little track. It doesn't really do anything other than signal a end of the game state if somebody goes too far down the track. I think it might break ties. I'm not sure. It didn't never come up. But what also happens when you take corruption is you take these little Fomori tokens, these little triangle tokens that you're going to be placing on the board, which I think is kind of a cool idea because it allows you to, in a non-cooperative game, it allows you to progress the board state for the AI player, I guess, that's the game itself, on the same turn where you take your action. You see that a lot in co-op games like in Legendary or Pandemic, where a part of every player's turn is also progressing the board state for the game. But you don't see that as often in non-cooperative games like you do here in The Arrival. The problem with that, though, is how that action of progressing the board state for the AI tends to interact with how you're supposed to be interacting with the game. These demon tokens have to be placed on the board before you pass for the entire round. Now, you can place these demons in enemy territories in a way that makes them lose encampments, makes them lose board presence in this game of area majority. That's a dangerous move to make, though, because while you have a stack of Fomori you have to place, your opponents also likely have a giant stack of Fomori they have to place. So you can find yourself in kind of an interesting Cold War of mutual destruction type situation, where you don't want to be taking out other people's encampments with your Fomori in case they do the same thing to you. Which sounds interesting, and it would be interesting, but the problem is that I said that can happen. See, what more commonly happens is, instead of placing demons in enemy territories, trying to remove enemy presence from the map, most people just kind of drop those demons down next to their own encampments so that they can fight them to gain points or reduce their corruption. In fact, you often don't even want to be dropping your demons down into enemy territory, because if you do, You're just giving valuable points or corruption to your opponents. And that's where this thematic dissonance comes in. It doesn't make any inherent sense to be gaining resources and some corruption just to get a demon, to put the demon onto your own space, to kill it, to lose your corruption. And that happens a lot in this game. There's certainly moments, especially towards the end of the game when the map starts filling up, that you'll be placing down these Fomori tokens to try to remove opponents from the map, but that doesn't seem to happen all that often. Now, this is something that could easily iron itself out with a few more plays, and I'd like to revisit the game, like I said, to see if that's the case. But based on my first few plays, I think I played it 2 or 3 times, this is the way the game's played out, and it doesn't really make any sense. So, I will try that again later, and I will come back to report on it when I have learned more about it. And that was The Arrival, designed by Martin Wallace. On to our feature review of the day. Today we're talking about 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, designed by Tim Hutchings and published independently by Tim Hutchings. So this is an interesting one. This is a solo RPG, which is an interesting premise, and I don't think there are too many of them on the market. I hadn't really heard of this idea before, and with a little research, I didn't really see too many other options like this. Essentially, the game is a book that you read through. Now, having heard that, and if you were to read a synopsis for the game, you might compare it to something like a choose your own adventure book. At least that was my expectation going in. But man, I was completely wrong. It's hard to talk about 1,000-Year-Old Vampire without giving you a little context for how the game is played. Essentially, 1,000-Year-Old Vampire is a choose your own adventure book, but it doesn't have any specific plot. It doesn't have any specific direction, and you don't really make any decisions of great consequence. That is probably an oversimplification, and maybe a little bit of an overexaggeration, but let's get into it a little bit. At the beginning of the game, you're going to create a character for yourself. Your character is going to have some key characteristics: possessions you have, people you know, a couple other little things, but most importantly, you'll have some memories that you start off with. But we'll get to those in a second. Essentially, as you play, you're going to be presented with a series of generic writing prompts. They might say something like, you find something of value related to your past. Add a new resource. Once you've read that prompt, you have to look back on what you've written down already, because this is a game that requires a lot of writing. You're going to look back at your memories, your resources, the people you know, and you're going to figure out how that prompt relates to your character as they are now, and you're going to write a response out to that prompt. Then after you've done that, you're going to assign that experience that you've come up with to a specific memory that your vampire has. Now, these memories are the most important part of the game, because what the game seeks to emulate is a immortal being passing through the centuries and struggling to hold on to memories of their past. As you're playing through the game and you're responding to prompts and you're adding these experiences to your memory, you have to keep a constant eye on how many memories you have. The moment you hit 5 memories and you need to create a new memory, you have to cross out one of your existing memories, and your character forgets whatever that was. And that could be something related to your past as a non-vampire. It could be a terrible other vampire that you've had dealings with. It could be a human that you've fallen in love with. It could be anything. And what you choose to remember and what you choose to forget will affect how you approach prompts in the future and how your character's able to confront obstacles that they come across, at least in theory. As I've explained this, it's probably become more and more clear that this isn't a simple choose your own adventure type deal. This is not a passive form of entertainment. In fact, if you try to approach this as a passive form of entertainment, you won't really get anything out of it. Each prompt that you read provides you with very little detail, and it's up to you to flesh it out, to liken it to the character that you've created. And there's a lot of customization, there's a lot of options for creativity, and that's something the game does really, really well. If you want to have your vampire be a ancient Roman or a Native American or somebody that grew up in feudal Japan or something like that, you can definitely do that. And the prompts are so generic that you can easily liken what's happening to your character to their time period or to themselves as a person. And that's one of the things the game does really well. It's a very interesting idea, which kind of leads up to my main point about 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, which is that as a whole, it's a very interesting, thought-provoking, and explorative experience. but I don't think it's necessarily a very good game. For one thing, it never feels like you're truly role playing. Part of that really isn't the system's fault because you're forced to write down your actions rather than saying them out loud to a group, which means that even the quicker, more menial prompts can turn into a bit of a slog. First, you read the prompt, then you have to consider where this experience will fit into what you've already done. Then you have to consider any of your assets and resources or any of your friends or enemies and see how they might play in. Then you write down the experience, then you add it to a memory. And when you're going through this process for 15, 20, 25 prompts, it can make each session really start to drag. It doesn't help that you don't have any meaningful decisions to make either. At least not really. Occasionally, a prompt will come up that causes you to sacrifice something, like a skill or a resource. But you can pick anything that's available to you, and it's up to you to just kind of weave that into the story you've created. Now, it makes sense that a prompt has to be open form like this, because you've got so much customization in how you create your character and how you choose to play the game. There's no way the game could predict what you'd be doing and then try to respond to that. There is a potential end condition, I guess you'd call it, where if you have to give up a skill, asset, or resource, and if you can't, then the game ends. So I guess potentially you could find yourself in a situation where you're trying to choose what asset to give up, and if you can't give it up, you lose. But because you're free to make the decision of what you give up, I don't see this really being an issue unless you just hit a spot of bad luck where you hit a bunch of prompts in a row that tell you to discard the things that you've been gathering. And to add on to that, playing this is exhausting. Anybody that spent a considerable amount of time working on something creative can tell you that being creative is exhausting. And this game requires you to not just be creative, it never gives you a break. For every moment that you're playing this game, you're going to be trying to formulate ways for the newest prompt to fit into your story, figuring out which entries to give up, writing out your response. You're constantly going while you're playing this game. Now, naturally, you're welcome to go at your own pace. This is a solo game. But the more I pulled out 1000-Year-Old Vampire to play, the harder it was to convince myself to do it because I knew how much work was going to be involved, even if I was just playing for 20 minutes. That wasn't really the big issue, though. Perhaps the key element that turned me off 2000-Year-Old Vampire was the lack of any real narrative element. This manifests itself in two ways as you're playing the game. First, your story never really goes anywhere. And two, your story rarely interacts with itself. Now, the book sets you up for this. It tells you while you're reading the rules, and there are quite a few rules for a supposedly quick and easy solo game like this. The rules say that elements may come up only once in the story and then never show up again, never affect your timeline, never affect your character. And the book tells you that that's okay because that's the way life is, which may be true, but that doesn't make for a very engaging experience. Every once in a while, you'll have events linked together. You'll have a prompt that ties nicely into a previous prompt, and you'll be able to interact with a character you've interacted with in the past. And those moments are cool, where you're like, oh, wow, this was set up perfectly 2 prompts ago, and now I'm meeting this character again, and I'm able to get the drop on them or do something like that. But those moments are really rather few and far between, and they get lost amidst the random events that are more commonly happening. And for me at least, it's ultimately hard to get divested into a story when you know that ultimately it's not going anywhere. And that's probably my biggest criticism for the game. You'll play for 30 minutes, sometimes a couple of hours altogether for a single character, and then it will suddenly just end. No character arc, no narrative structure, it doesn't build up to anything. You have a character that you've crafted and spent a lot of time writing about and creating friends for and watching loved ones die off, and then you'll just have the thing kind of end. When it ends, it's like, that's it, it's over. When you read a book, it builds to a climax. When you play a session of Dungeons and Dragons, it often builds to a final confrontation. But 1000-Year-Old Vampire goes for a while and then either peters out or just kind of ends abruptly, and it's up to you to kind of sit there and be like, okay, well, I guess this is how that happened. Now, I know I've made all this sound very bad, and I suppose it is kind of bad from a gaming standpoint, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the experience that 1000-Year-Old Vampire offers you is necessarily a poor experience. In fact, I think there's probably a very strong audience for this game. For one, I think this would be a great writing prompt generator for any aspiring authors. It also has a lot of introspective moments. So for people that just want to kind of sit and think and dwell upon a character that they've created and the struggles that they find themselves in, I think this could be an experience that is meaningful for some people. And I get the feeling the author has a similar perspective. There's a little section at the beginning of the book that talks about paying attention to how you feel as you play Thousand-Year-Old Vampire, making sure that you maintain a healthy mental state while you're playing. Because as you're playing through the game, it's very possible that tragic, horrible things can happen to your character or to those around them. And so it makes me wonder if the creator of this game thought of it less as a game and more as a series of thought exercises, more as a series of hypothetical questions that you could pose about moral dilemmas or philosophical topics and things like that. And I think anybody who's interested in an experience that involves a lot of thought around those types of topics could probably appreciate Thousand-Year-Old Vampire. As long as they're willing to put in the effort and the time it takes to really flesh things out and appreciate the experience as a whole. But again, at the end of the day, it's really not a very good game, and I wouldn't ever recommend it to somebody as such. But if any of that sounded interesting to you, definitely check it out. You will know if this is an experience that you're interested in, and if it's an experience you're interested in, I think it's one that you'll really enjoy. And that's it for today. Thank you all for listening to Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast. My name is Ryan Krim, and I'd like to wish you a great weekend. Game on. Thank you for listening to the Learn Your Own Rules podcast. This podcast is created, produced, directed, and edited by Ryan Krim. Please send help.